The End is the Beginning on NES Works episode 108.
Been a fool before, wouldn't like to get my love caught in the slamming door.
The name on this game's box may come from the word ultimate, which means final, but Ultima Exodus is anything but the end. On the contrary, it's a pivotal first for the NES, the first proper role-playing adventure to reach the US. This is somehow a perfectly appropriate debut, and also a jumbled mess of ahistoric localization. The Ultima series helped create the electronic role-playing genre entirely, and it represents every bit as foundational a work as wizardry. I've spoken about wizardry far more often here than I have Ultima, simply because games in the wizardry mode, full-scale first-person dungeon crawlers, are more easily spotted and stand out from the usual console RPG fare that we see in the US. Well, that so-called usual console RPG fare owes its existence in large part to Ultima, as distilled through major Famicom works like Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy. But you can see Ultima's influence throughout the NES and Famicom libraries. The switch from adventure scene to first-person dungeon exploration, seen in the likes of Portopia Renzoku Satsujin Jiken and Sukeban Deka 2, the first-person maze combat sequences in Golgo 13, the first-person adventure scenes in The Goonies 2 and Dr. Chaos, the fact that you have to beat up a bunch of pirates in Final Fantasy in order to gain access to a boat, the shrines where you perform class-related actions in Dragon Quest III. All of those items were probably less a case of developers riffing only on wizardry and at least as much of a nod to the Ultima games, which involved perspective shifts into first person as early as the series' precursor, 1979's Akalabeth, playing through Ultima Exodus with the hindsight of several decades of derivative works, feels almost like an act of digital archaeology for console RPGs, unearthing the origins of the species and tracing trends and design concepts to their primal roots. Ultima Exodus for NES adapts the third game in the Apple II-based role-playing series. Exodus was the first Ultima entry that most people view as a properly enduring take on the RPG, as opposed to the first two games, and Akalabeth, which comes off as designer Richard Garriott making it up as he went along. So in that sense, it only seems proper for the NES to take its journey into RPGs by placing this particular foot forward first. Of course, this wasn't the first proper RPG to reach consoles in America. Sega beat FCI and Pony Canyon to the punch by a matter of 3 months with Phantasy Star, a second-generation descendant of Ultima. Just like Ultima Exodus, Phantasy Star involves traveling to different lands by way of vehicles, switching to alternate viewpoints for dungeon exploration and combat, roaming a zoomed-out overworld before switching to a more detailed point of view when entering towns and other locations of note. Phantasy Star iterated on the concepts laid down by the original release of Exodus 5 years earlier, as distilled by the likes of Dragon Warrior. Now, just months later, NES fans could experience the original inspiration for themselves. Granted, Phantasy Star looked and played a whole lot more impressively than Ultima Exodus, and not just because of Yuji Naka's sweet-ass first-person dungeon animations. Exodus sticks very much to the 8 and 16-bit premise that console RPGs looked horrendously primitive compared to literally any other genre due to the sheer volume of content that they had to cram into a few hundred kilobytes of storage space. Compared to the visual advances being made by developers in other genres on NES, Exodus looks very much like someone dropped a cave painting into a display at the Tate Modern. It didn't help Exodus's case that quite a few more visually and mechanically satisfying descendants had already made their way to NES. Games like Rygar, Rambo, and especially Zelda 2 may never have existed without Ultima to inspire Falcom to create its more action-driven takes on the RPG formula, which Namco then streamlined into Dragon Buster and everyone else ripped off with a swiftness. Yes, Falcom definitely took notes from Ultima. One of the more amusing anecdotes of near misses in video game history has to do with Falcom pitching Garriott on the prospect of collaborating on localizations. Legend has it that the talks came to an abrupt end once Garriott realized that several in-game illustrations in Dragon Slayer 2 Xanadu were traced directly from the Ultima manual. So here we have a foundational work of the genre, introducing players to RPGs. And make no mistake, the video game-loving audiences of the late 1980s were far more fragmented than today's audiences, for whom access to personal computers is taken as a near-universal given. Home computers were expensive in the late 80s, unless they were so old and limited as to be affordable, and many console players never used them at all, or at least never used computers that could support games actually worth playing. Unlike today's gamers who have broad awareness of new titles and genres, regardless of the platforms they prefer to play on, many NES-owning kids in 1989 had never played anything but simple action titles. NES adoption had only properly begun to snowball in the US the year before, as it reached a sort of critical mass that made it clear to parents that this wouldn't be another flash-in-the-pan fad, so families could finally retire their dusty, disused Atari systems in favor of Nintendo's new console. Nintendo certainly recognized this fact. The role-playing genre had exploded in popularity on Famicom in 1987 with the launch of Dragon Quest II, and the following year saw no end of Dragon Quest clones bombard Japanese audiences. RPGs were big business on Famicom, and Nintendo wanted to cultivate that golden goose in the US as well. Look at the specific slate of games that Nintendo of America licensed in as first-party releases, or gave elaborate deluxe boxed versions to on NES and Super NES. Xanadu, Dragon Warrior, Final Fantasy, Illusion of Gaia, Earthbound. No, the RPG didn't truly take off for American console enthusiasts until the PlayStation era, but it certainly wasn't for a lack of effort by Nintendo. And those ambitions first manifested here with Ultima Exodus, as we consider, what did Nintendo Power say? The third issue of Nintendo Power, which hit subscribers' mailboxes toward the end of 1988, featured a sizable section called simply, "What is an RPG?" The magazine attempted to explain the genre's principles across 10 pages by highlighting a pair of upcoming releases, Legacy of the Wizard and Ultima Exodus. Now, we can debate just how much of an RPG Legacy of the Wizard actually turned out to be, honestly not nearly as much of one as, say, Zelda 2, but this feature did its best to distill Ultima's complexity down into 4 pages. An entire page details the different character classes available for players to use, albeit without really explaining how best to integrate those classes into a party. And then a 2-page spread lays out the key quest objectives and tasks that players will need to tackle. While vague and not especially helpful, the Nintendo Power feature does convey just how much players needed to accomplish in order to complete Exodus. And the magazine makes it look as exciting as possible, given the rudimentary visuals, by pairing screenshots with gorgeous illustrations by Katsuya Terada. Did this feature sell anyone on Ultima? It's hard to say, but an entire thread of Nintendo of America's early marketing efforts made their start here. As for this version of Ultima Exodus, well, it's hardly a simple direct adaptation of the Apple II original. The differences in hardware between the Apple II, a 1970s home computer with idiosyncratic graphical capabilities, and the NES, a 1980s home console with completely different idiosyncrasies to its graphical capabilities, required some changes. Oh, and the lack of keyboard support for NES factored in there as well. So, this take on Ultima uses a new windowed, cursor-driven menu interface that appears to have been plucked from, what else, Dragon Quest. I have very little doubt that the appearance of Dragon Quest on Famicom prompted Pony Canyon to begin snatching up the rights to convert significant Western role-playing properties and rework them in the image of Enix's hit. Ultima was simply the first to roll off the assembly line. A little-known company called Newtopia Planning, not to be mistaken for Utopia Planitia, handled the actual conversion work for Pony. The internet doesn't yield an awful lot of information about Newtopia, not to be mistaken for Newtopia, aside from the fact that they converted a few Ultima games to NES and MSX in the late 80s before vanishing from history. They did, however, develop a single original work. Well, for a certain value of the word original anyway. A quirky Space Harrier clone called Attack Animal Gakuen, one of the handful of titles to make use of the Famicom 3D system accessory. Nintendo chronicler The Almighty Guru speculates that Newtopia, not to be mistaken for New Topiary, worked out a trade arrangement with Pony. The developer would convert some American computer RPGs to Famicom as long as Pony would publish their pet project, a blatant knockoff of Space Harrier, inexplicably starring a schoolgirl in place of Sega's muscular hero. Whatever the case, I think this is about as good a conversion of Ultima Exodus to NES as you could expect, given the enhancement technology available in late 1987, when the game made its Famicom debut in Japan. It's the first third-party NES release to feature a battery backup option, and if it wasn't the first Famicom cart to include a battery, it was right there at the cutting edge, much to the dismay of fans of Atlus's Megami Tensei, which shipped a few weeks before Ultima and required players to record their progress with passwords. Not that the inclusion of a save battery reduces the friction of this game experience all that much. Players can only record their progress in a handful of inns, located around the world. It's slightly more convenient than Dragon Warrior forcing players to return to Tentacle Castle to save their progress by speaking to the king, but only just. Especially before you track down the Compass Heart item, which allows you to warp back to Lord British's castle from anywhere in the world. To be honest, Ultima Exodus makes for a daunting introduction to the genre. For Famicom RPG nuts, Exodus was preceded by quite a few other RPGs. Not only Dragon Quest and its sequel, but also Megami Tensei, The Glory of Heracles, and Legacy of the Wizard. You know, assuming you consider that an actual RPG. It's not. Here though, Pony Canyon just tossed American kids into the deep end of the pool and left them to figure it out. We weren't totally unprepared for Ultima though. Games like the aforementioned Zelda 2, Rygar, and yes, Rambo had already introduced the fine art of hit monsters get stronger, so central to Ultima's gameplay. And of course, The Legend of Zelda, a 6 degrees distillation of the RPG by way of Dragon Slayer and Duraga, featured an open-ended quest structure similar to Ultima's. But even retooled for NES, Ultima Exodus has an unapologetic fidelity to its computing roots, and plays exactly like you'd expect an RPG from the early 1980s to play. For example, leveling up your characters to become stronger plays a critical role in Exodus, but it's much less friendly here than in any of the RPGs and RPG-adjacent games that landed on NES around the same time. You don't simply kill monsters, earn experience, and level up as soon as you hit a certain experience threshold. Instead, you need to return to Lord British's castle and talk to the ruler of the land in order to ascend to a new level. And even though you command a party of 4 warriors drawn from a guild of more than a dozen potential participants, whom you can swap into and out of your party as needed, the party doesn't gain experience equally. No matter how much a given character contributes to a battle, they only earn experience for landing a killing blow on an enemy. This gives ranged attackers a huge advantage, since battles play out in a proto-tactical style that draws on the genre's tabletop roots. Each combatant receives a single turn per round in which they can attack, cast spells, use a tool, or move a single space in order to position themselves more advantageously on the field. Bow wielders and spellcasters can easily mop up an entire enemy party before melee fighters manage to land a single blow. Healers and other support characters end up on even worse footing, since their pitiful ranged attacks barely inflict any damage. You also need to manage each character individually, not only their leveling, but also their inventory and equipment, and even their cash on hand. There's no such thing as a collective pool of money here, which adds a lot of extra steps to the simple process of buying a single piece of gear for a character. You may collectively have the money to buy, say, your dwarf barbarian an axe, but if the barbarian doesn't have sufficient funds in their own possession, they're out of luck until you fuss around in menus long enough to transfer cash. It's all the joy of splitting a complicated check at dinner, but without the chance to enjoy a nice meal. Oh, and you don't earn cash by simply defeating monsters. Instead, you have to hope that the enemies you've defeated drop a chest full of money, which one character can open and claim, as they cross their fingers that the thing isn't booby-trapped. If this all sounds like a dreadful slog, sure. Ultima Exodus for NES hasn't aged with any particular grace. It's about as clunky as the first 2 Dragon Warriors, though more complicated and therefore cumbersome, and it doesn't even feature lovable, iconic Akira Toriyama monster designs to ease the pain. So why then, may you ask, would anyone ever have wanted to play this game? Well, legacy aside, in the context of February 1989, Ultima Exodus offered NES owners an experience they simply couldn't find in any other cartridge. The land of Sosaria isn't especially huge by modern RPG standards, it's certainly no Daggerfall, but the entire realm offers you almost total freedom of exploration. A few barriers and gates exist along the way, and overcoming those obstructions comprises the bulk of your quest. For example, you need to find 4 mystic crests that will allow you to pass obstacles or seals. The process of actually finding those crests involves gathering clues, venturing into the world, and completing dungeon mazes. At some point, you need to commandeer a ship from a legion of buccaneers in order to take to the sea. In order to accomplish that, you need to earn experience until Lord British will upgrade your party to a specific level at which pirates begin to spawn on the overworld map. You need to keep track of lunar phases in order to use special moon gates to travel around the world. You have to make your way to the hidden continent of Ambrosia in order to find special shrines, where you can make donations in order to boost different characters' stats. You need to explore the world on foot, by boat, and even on horseback, a task complicated by the line of sight mechanic that only allows you to see the environment the way your party would. That includes single tile line of sight when in forests and other unfriendly environments, which can obscure essential destinations and deadly monsters alike. You need to figure out the value of buying food or quaffing booze at the pub, yes, actual alcohol consumption in an NES game. And you need to roll a party of warriors, assigning one of 5 races to a dozen classes with 50 skill points to distribute, with no real guidance on optimal builds outside of some loose suggestions in the manual. Ultima Exodus may run on a console, but the heart of a computer RPG beats in its proverbial chest. It would be followed by a string of similar games, mostly from Pony Canyon and FCI, all of which managed to convert their PC source materials to console with varying degrees of success, but none of which have managed to land in the collective NES fan memory quite like Ultima Exodus did. There's something to be said for being first, I suppose, but also this really does feel like the console RPG. You can point to any feature of Exodus and trace its evolution through descendants, like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, from the way you start those games in a castle and its adjacent castle town, to the granular turn order of combat. While this game doesn't necessarily work here as an introduction to RPGs, it's more of a pro-grade adventure with a high learning curve and a quest that demands a massive amount of time invested into grinding for cash and experience in slow-paced combat. Ultima Exodus has a place of honor on NES. And from the charming new character sprites to the repetitive but never too grating music, it hints at the shape of the genre to come. Next time on NES Works, we go from role-playing to know your role-playing.